sort of this vicious cycle where, a tragedy occurs. We ask for policing. The policing doesn't work. We maybe carve out a little money to put a cone on a street corner as a bump out, and then it doesn't work, and then someone dies, and we repeat this cycle, right? And I think it's hard. We primarily engage with transportation departments, and even within those spaces where those engineers and those planners know that the best way to keep folks safe is a really great elevated sidewalk and really strong protected bike lanes and really narrow roads and lots of great signage and lots of lighting and all these things that we care about, they too will sometimes become defensive and say, well, but we need the police for X, Y, and Z. And I think that there's an interesting thing that happens where we hear we're overworked. We can't put a police officer in every street corner. But then the second someone like me says, great, that actually isn't the best use of your time. We need many millions more dollars to put a bike lane in. People freak out because I'm taking a parking space away, right? So there is this push and pull where it's there's this inability to connect the dots. And I struggle as an advocate trying to make it clear that I think it's really okay for us to take a parking space away because it will literally save lives. It will save us money. It will be better for the police department. It will be better for the transportation department. It will be better for the thousands of people who travel along that corridor every day. And we can find a different place to store that vehicle. All of these things can happen at the same time. And so I just want to acknowledge this sort of cycle that we're in, and that it's really hard to decouple those natural, that we all do, those natural sort of reactions. The assumption that putting a bike lane down, putting in a really great crossing for pedestrians is going to cause catastrophic congestion, and that we just can't do that. And the only solution is to, put a police officer out there with a speed gun and hope for the best.
Good evening. I'm Katherine Carlson, Executive Director of the Rappaport Institute at Harvard University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here and my honor to be partnering with the GBH Forum Network, Livable Streets Alliance, and the Program on Criminal Justice here at the Harvard Kennedy School to host this important conversation on traffic safety, enforcement, and prosecution, which provide a conceptually valuable entry point to thinking about the racialization of our criminal justice system overall. The inception of this program began with the work that Dr. Felix Owusu has been conducting in Massachusetts, assessing the Suffolk County DA office's non-prosecution and diversion policy for nonviolent offenses, which was implemented by former District Attorney Rachel Rollins in 2019. Felix is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is trained as an economist, and his research seeks to understand the application of law and bureaucratic processes in law enforcement agencies and their impacts across race and class. Felix has also recently served as a data scientist in the DC Metropolitan Police Department and as a research fellow at Harvard Law School's Criminal Justice Policy Program, where he was the lead researcher on the report on racial disparities in the Massachusetts criminal system, which was submitted to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 2020. Felix's research on non-prosecution and recidivism is complemented by new analysis from the Livable Streets Alliance on the effectiveness of policing as a traffic safety measure, which I first learned about as I serve as a board member for the organization. This new report, just released today, also includes recommendations on how Massachusetts can make our streets safer without the often harmful effects of traffic stops on Black and Brown drivers. Stacy Thompson, Executive Director of the Livable Streets Alliance, joins us to discuss this work. As Executive Director, Stacy oversees all the organization's programs, including Vision Zero, Better Buses, and the Emerald Network, to name a few. She has led the organization since 2016 and remains optimistic about addressing the challenges that Metro Boston and many urban areas are facing, including increasing access to jobs and affordable housing, improving safety and public health outcomes, and building climate resiliency. You may have seen her on a GBH program before, as she is a frequently sought guest and speaks passionately about improving our streets, not simply as a transportation issue, but one of justice, equity, and opportunity. And finally, We are privileged to have this work contextualized and the conversation guided by Professor Alexandra Natapoff, the Lee S. Kreinler Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She is an award-winning legal scholar and criminal justice expert. Professor Natapoff writes about criminal courts, public defense, plea bargaining, wrongful convictions, and race and inequality in the criminal system. Her book, Punishment Without Crime: How Our Massive Misdemeanor System Traps the Innocent and Makes America More Unequal, reveals the powerful influence that misdemeanors exert over the US criminal justice system. Besides being a frequently cited legal scholar, she served as an assistant federal public defender in Baltimore before joining the academy, so brings great on-the-ground insight as well. I look forward to learning much from her and from all three panelists in this conversation. Thank you all for being with us. Professor, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Rappaport Institute for including me in this important conversation. I too am learning a lot from our panelists, so this is an exciting conversation for me to be in as well. I'd like to take just a few minutes to take a step back for all of us to think about why this is such an important conversation and why it is about so much more than traffic, about why it is about so much more even than the Suffolk County DA's office, which has been a leader in this space. And I'd like to invite everyone to understand this conversation as part of a larger conversation about our criminal justice system, the enormous criminal penal net that we have created and which touches so many aspects of all of our lives, but particularly with respect to what we call misdemeanors, low-level offenses, sometimes called petty offenses. It turns out that although we have not paid sufficient attention to this aspect of our criminal system, misdemeanors are mostly what the American criminal system does. 80% of our criminal case docket, that is the number of criminal cases filed in the United States every year, are misdemeanors. They're classified as these low-level offenses. Most people, most Americans, encounter the criminal system through the misdemeanor system, through the low-level criminal process. And because it is so enormous and so broad and criminalizes, I'm going to say that, I'm going to repeat that word because it is so important in the context of this conversation. It criminalizes such low-level minor conduct. We are here today to talk about the policies at the Suffolk County DA's office, which was to decline to prosecute many of those cases. We're here to talk about traffic and the policing of our streets. 26 states, half of the states, treat speeding as a criminal misdemeanor. In other words, when we think about crime and justice and public safety, we often don't realize that actually the vast bulk of what our criminal system does involves conduct and behavior and individual state interactions that we might not actually think of as criminal at all. They're not harmful, they're not dangerous, they're not scary, and yet, so much of the time, we deploy the criminal apparatus to manage it. And when we understand our misdemeanor system in this way, we can see how the work of these advocates and scholars is so important to understanding not just criminal justice, but actually our system of governance, that we have devoted the resources of our democracy and the vast bulk of our criminal system to policing and criminalizing conduct that almost everyone engages in, that is easy to engage in, that we often don't think twice about engaging. Traffic, but also low-level offenses like loitering, jaywalking, spitting, littering. All over the country, people are being prosecuted and criminalized and punished for conduct such as this. So the misdemeanor system, if you will, is an authority that we confer on the state. And of course, it's so appropriate that we're here with the Rappaport Center and the Harvard Kennedy School and its work on American governance, that this is one of the central ways that we govern. It has implications for racial inequality in this country. It has implications for poverty and the welfare state in this country. It has implications, of course, for policing and the intrusions that we permit the state to engage in into our liberty and our privacy. and it has enormous implications for the resources that are available to the state in its effort to create, if I might borrow your term, livable streets, livable spaces, livable cities, livable communities, in places where we and our families can thrive. So I'm thrilled to be here having this conversation with these scholars and advocates. What I'd like to do is turn the conversation over first to Dr. Owusu and then to Ms. Thompson, and give them a chance to tell us about their work, about their studies, about their efforts, and then we'll engage in a little bit of a conversation. I want to make sure that they get a chance to talk to each other in a way that we can listen in on, and then hopefully we'll have some time to get questions from all of you. So if I might, Dr. Owusu.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you everybody for tuning in today. I'm gonna tell you guys just a little bit about the research that I worked on to sort of set the stage. And then I'm really excited to get into the implications and have this conversation broaden. But just to give you guys some context, the research that I worked on looked at policies that were implemented by DA Rollins when she took office. The policies that she put into place had several different aspects to them, but the piece that I looked at most directly was the presumptive non-prosecution policy. And put simply, that was a policy that she gave guidance to her line ADAs, sort of the prosecutors who are facing new cases, where there was a presumption that she wanted to put in place that for a group of 15 nonviolent misdemeanors that include driving with a suspended license, which is one of the most, it's actually the most common offense charged in Suffolk County over this time period and makes up a huge percentage of the overall caseload, but a group of other offenses as well that are in this nonviolent misdemeanor space that was just laid out. The idea here was to have the presumption be that those cases would no longer be prosecuted and they would be declined essentially outright on the day that they were brought. And this was not necessarily just a blanket policy. I think there was a lot of great guidance there that talked about alternatives to criminal prosecution that line ADA should consider and think about the root causes that lead to the kinds of conduct that people are not happy about, and thinking about connecting folks with the services they need to address those root causes. But the piece that I looked at the most directly was this decline to prosecute piece, both to understand, did it actually happen and to what extent did it happen, and what was the impact of this on public safety? Something that a lot of people try to operationalize as recidivism, or looking at, how are the people who were impacted by this policy, do they come back later with new cases or more serious cases? I think one of the common pieces of criticism that came out when this policy was being discussed and announced was that people believe that this might lead to more serious crime or violent crime if we're not, throwing the book at folks for this less serious stuff. It'll always escalate and lead to more serious things. And so this is one of the things that I set out to understand and see what the impact of this policy. And so just to give you the quick highlight, I found that the policy's impact was sort of as described. We did see a decrease in prosecution rates for offenses that were included in the list. And so we did see the reduction in prosecution that was sort of discussed. And there actually was no corresponding increase in recidivism. So if you look at people and follow them afterwards we were able to follow them for a year. And other studies have looked at this for different time periods as well. We did not see any evidence of an increase in recidivism, both for any new case in general or looking specifically at violent offenses that people were particularly worried about in this context. So those fears, it turned out, never materialized in terms of declining to prosecute these offenses, leading to more serious conduct. And I think, to me, that was somewhat intuitive, but I wanted to do that research to sort of inform this conversation. It has never struck me that the kind of person who is going to get in trouble for, say, speeding or a really low-level offense is like, that's not the same situation that leads to very serious violence or murder or something. And so that link was a little bit tenuous in my mind, but it's one that comes up a lot when we think about these kinds of policies. And so it's one that we looked into. And I just wanted to highlight other folks who have looked at this policy as well, have found similar results, and sometimes even found decreases in recidivism as a result of this policy. That's something that I want to get into a little bit later, but I'll just put a pin in that for now. So this was, I think, really important for my understanding of this policy, but I wanted to dig in a little bit further and really understand heterogeneity, or more broadly, is this policy's impact biggest for certain types of cases or certain types of defendants, like certain types of people? And so we did see that the cases or the policy's impacts were by far the largest and most concentrated for these folks who are facing these motor vehicle offenses, these driving offenses, and specifically driving with a suspended license. That's where the biggest impacts were across the board. And so we didn't quite see as much movement in things like shoplifting, breaking and entering, and other categories of conduct that were listed in this memo. But it seems like when discretion was introduced and folks were given the option to decline to prosecute these cases, they were very willing to deploy that discretion specifically on these motor vehicle cases, these traffic cases. And I also saw evidence of a broader shift, not just confined to the 15 offenses that were on this list of offenses that DA Rollins created in consultation with law enforcement and the defense bar, as well as the other folks in the community. We actually saw evidence of a broader shift as prosecution rates dropped for motor vehicle misdemeanors in general. So ones that were not listed in the policy actually saw a decrease as well. And so driving with a suspended license is the most common of these offenses, but we also saw things like unlicensed driving or driving without proper insurance being declined at higher rates as well. These offenses together make up a staggering amount of the overall caseload, just those 3 offense codes. And this is stuff that before I got into this kind of work really struck me as administrative stuff, sort of to our earlier conversation during the introduction, right? I was honestly surprised to find out that some of this was handled by criminal courts when I first started doing this work. But you can actually face very serious consequences for these offenses. If you are driving with a suspended license and you get caught the first time, that comes with potential jail time and a fine of hundreds or up to $1,000, right? And so this is something that's actually quite serious, and it really does speak to criminalization. Even very short jail spells can have huge impacts on people's lives. That's enough time to lose your job, to lose custody of your kids, or have any other kind of negative things happen to you. And so that was something that I think this policy's impact is going to, I think, be real and lead to fewer of these externalities. I think one other thing that this highlights is that this was a recognition that this is the beginning of a process of criminalization. And when given discretion to choose to not prosecute cases, we saw that was being deployed to take people off of this on-ramp to the criminal legal system, right? When we talk about criminalization in Massachusetts, you can actually get your license suspended for just getting too many speeding tickets, right? So it really, really is, I think, a connection that takes conduct that is, people would think of, and in Massachusetts, I think a speeding ticket is just going to be a civil infraction, right? But it's still, if you, are unlucky or are not able to, make the right payments or, what have you, it is an on-ramp to that. And so we did see, I think, evidence of a broader shift in where not just the offense of driving with a suspended license, but these kinds of traffic and motor vehicle offenses that really seemed administrative in nature were being declined at higher rates. And so I want to get into that a little bit more. But the last thing I want to end with in my sort of introductory remarks were a bit of a cautionary tale, and specifically think about racial disparities in the context of discretionary policies, right? This is a policy that really put a lot of the power in the hands of people who are handling these cases day to day to decide when to decline these cases. And there was, I think, very thoughtful guidance, but at the end of the day, it was a person who had to make this decision based on their discretion. And they were still, of course, free to prosecute cases if they thought there was an immediate public safety concern or something else going on. And given that context, we actually saw that the impacts of this policy were much smaller for Black defendants, right? They're about half as big for Black defendants as they were for white defendants and Latinx defendants, right? And so it's intuitive to think that reducing prosecution is going to be good for racial equity, given the substantial racial disparities that we see in this caseload. But this shows that you really have to think a little bit harder, and disparities can persist, even worsen when we use discretion as our means for addressing problems in the criminal legal system. And so I'll end with that for now, and we can jump back to some more of these details. But at a very high level, this policy seemed to do what it said it was going to do, and the impacts seemed to be real, but we did not really see any of the backlash that people were worried about.
Thank you so much. I probably don't need to do that for this crowd, but just in an abundance of caution to frame and to emphasize just how important this kind of work is, Dr. Owusu's work is, in part because the policy of then DA Rollins was cutting edge. she was a leader, a national leader in announcing that as the prosecutor, indeed she ran on this platform, she announced to the voters that part of her progressive policies were going to be to decline, that is to fail to prosecute, to permit the arrest to be the last contact with the criminal system, this list of 15 misdemeanors. And now, all over the country, many other prosecutors have adopted these policies. I've worked with prosecutor offices who look to DA Rollins' policies to think about their own policies, to emphasize this profound rethinking of the prosecutorial function, the true costs and benefits of prosecuting these low-level offenses when our criminal system is also not what it should be when it comes to violent crime, when it comes to more serious crime and the resources that we might want to devote to those. So it just is worth appreciating just how groundbreaking and courageous DA Rollins was at the time. This was before these were common policies. And it makes work like Dr. Owusu's possible. And I just want to articulate why. Because DA Rollins at the time said that she was willing to share the data on these policies with empirical researchers like Dr. Owusu and others, and that has not been the tradition of prosecution in this country. Prosecutor offices have in the main, with some notable exceptions, have not collected, let alone shared, the kinds of data that would permit a full public policy discussion of the true costs and the true benefits of policies like these. So that office and these policies have made the kinds of insights that Dr. Owusu just shared with us possible. And I want to just emphasize one other important frame about why this conversation is so much bigger than this DA's office, so much bigger than this report. As Dr. Owusu mentioned, that at least from his perspective, it might be intuitive, if that's the correct word that you used, intuitive that low-level offenses, people who drive on a suspended license because they can't afford, for example, to pay traffic tickets, a classic crime of poverty. Low-level offenses like loitering or trespassing or littering or spitting, that there's an intuition that these are not connected to the kinds of crimes that I teach when I teach criminal law, the sort of classic crimes of homicide and rape, and it turns out that intuition has not been given its full reign over the past 20 years. In fact, the opposite intuition, in the form of what we sometimes call broken windows theory, has actually been ascendant. And broken windows theory, just briefly, theorized that the over-enforcement of low-level offenses would prevent serious crime up the food chain. So not just that letting them go, letting those offenses go would increase recidivism in that space, but that actually those low-level offenses were directly connected to more serious crime. And we saw enormous increases in traffic stops, in stop and frisk, in order maintenance policing all over the country, most famously in New York. And so when Dr. Owusu says that there was no recidivism shown as a result of declining these offenses, it's worth noting that this is really a reversal of the thinking of the past several decades, which intuited wrongly that over-enforcing low-level offenses, that criminalizing people for low-level offenses would help us in in the spaces of more serious crime. So it's an especially important finding that was only made possible because DA Rollins and the office was willing to create a policy and then share the data. So it may be that everyone in this audience already knows this, but I think it's always worth appreciating why progress on these issues is made possible. So, Ms. Thompson, let me turn it over to you and the important work that your organization has been doing.
Thank you so much. And I am so grateful to be building on the incredible work of Dr. Owusu, and many, many other people. And I just want to contextualize who I am in this space. So thank you, Catherine Carlson, for your amazing introduction. I'm the executive director of Livable Streets. It's my job to be a traffic safety expert. And when I use the word safety, I am referring to safety from being hit by a car. And I am particularly focused on people walking and biking. There are lots of different ways to define safety, so I want to be clear about that. But I am also not a criminal justice expert. I am here with criminal justice experts who have doctors in front of their names. I am an advocate. And so, I might stumble around, but I'm here because as an advocate who cares about traffic safety, it is impossible for me not to care about criminal justice reform and for me not to acknowledge the role of policing in traffic enforcement. And so, I am here because traffic stops are the most common form of contact between civilians and the police. And we know that those forms of contact cause harm to Black and Brown folks. I'm not going to go into that data. It is enormous. Our report goes into that data, but it exists. We know it. It's a fact. So, but I also sit in a place where in 2021, 38,000 people died in traffic crashes in the United States. 38,000 people. That is a 10-year high. So what that also means is that traffic crashes are going up. People who are especially vulnerable are even people walking and biking, older adults, children are suffering at a greater rate. And that the mechanisms that we are employing are not working. Getting back to that intuition I had in my notes, gut reaction, everyone asks for more police enforcement. It's the same thing. When we have a serious crash in the city of Boston, when there's a bad crash, when there's a fatality, it's like clockwork. You see people ask for change and almost immediately ask for more police enforcement. We need more people out there. We need more people slowing down traffic. We need more police officers making sure people stop at that stop sign. What the data that we reviewed showed, however, is that there is very little evidence that traffic stops reduce crashes over the long term. So I know for people who are urbanists, you just sort of go like, what? What? This isn't actually helping necessarily. So to clarify, there is some evidence that in the short term, when there are speed traps, there is a short-term effect, right? And that effect maybe lasts a week, but then things go back to the status quo. In a report that used data from the Stanford Open Policing Project and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, it studied 33 state patrols and found no association between traffic stops and death rates from crashes. So what the data is showing from an urbanist perspective is that this mechanism of pulling people over for the purpose of safety is simply ineffective for the most dangerous behaviors. So if you're sitting with all of these things that I just said, we have a lot of crashes. There is a lot of evidence that's showing that the mechanisms we're using aren't necessarily working. Then for us, we have to ask two really important questions. If traffic stops are not effective, why are we pulling so many people over in the first place? And two, what should we be doing to actually make our roads safer? And so that is why Livable Streets is involved in this conversation. And that is why we wrote our report. I know the report's already in the chat. I'm going to say right now, it's 50 pages. I'm not going to talk about all of it tonight. I'm going to reference lots of stuff, but it is designed for practitioners. It is designed for people in government. So I would say if some of this information is new to you, we tried to create a tool that you could use to understand the issues and to actually have some practical next steps forward. And one of the tools that we created is a framework to help muddle through this reality that we have a real problem with traffic crashes, but we also have a real problem with the mechanisms that we are using to make our streets safer. And so the first piece of that framework that I want to introduce tonight is just looking at traffic stops and going through a process of determining if those stops are public safety related or if they are not safety related. And so a safety related stop might be running a red light, speeding, reckless driving, those behaviors that we know statistically do cause serious harm and death. Non-public safety stops, which tend to be the largest reason why someone is pulled over and then potentially go up the ladder that was discussed earlier, might include not having a broken light on the back of your car, potentially not wearing a seatbelt, which causes harm to the person inside a car. There's evidence, you should wear your seatbelt. We advocate for that. But in terms of hitting someone else, right, that's sort of a different kind of offense. And also all of the debt-based suspensions that were discussed earlier, and I will bring up again. In Massachusetts, there are about 200 different ways a person could be pulled over, and a pretty small fraction of those we would define as purely safety related. So, just starting this process of figuring out, is the purpose of this even related to safety, or is it related to something else, is something that we would recommend as a starting point. But I just want to name that, there are a lot of suggestions to start with just banning pretextual stops, or just directing police officers and police departments to just focus on those safety related stops. But from our perspective, that doesn't go far enough, and that does not mitigate all of the harm caused. So one example from Fayetteville, North Carolina, is that the police department there did, between 2013 and 2016, direct police officers to focus on the most serious offenses, the ones that could cause death or injury. And they did reduce the number of pretextual stops by a large amount, but the number of safety related stops increased from 9,000 to 60,000. So they didn't actually stop fewer people. And there was a small decrease in crashes, but it wasn't the kind of really big systemic change that we need to also reduce and eliminate the serious number of crashes. So some of these mechanisms are good, and we recommend them as starting points. Like, is this a safety stop? Is it not? Banning pretextual stops. But I just want to name that as urbanists and people who care about this, it is not enough to stop there. From our perspective, we need to begin a framework and a process of dismantling and moving away from infractions, from violations that cause harm and are not producing a good result. So again, we have a framework that you can look at. And our top recommendation, which will be a surprise to no one, is for governments and agencies to focus on the built environment first. The most effective way to reduce crashes is to build streets that make it hard, even for a person who's driving recklessly, even for a person who is trying to speed and can't, to do those activities. And you can do that by building streets a certain way. We also acknowledge in the report that we have 50, 60, 70 years of street design that is designed to help cars speed. That the federal government is allowing us to build cars that are designed to speed and are really big and really dangerous, and that we're not going to solve these problems overnight. So we do explore topics like civilian enforcement and automated enforcement, which I'm happy to dig into later, which do remove police officers from the direct interaction, but can also have forms of bias. So for example, a civilian can still make a choice to give a parking ticket to a person of color and give a warning to a white person. There is evidence that automated enforcement, which is like a speed camera or a red light camera, those cameras are effective in reducing the number of crashes, reducing speeding overall. However, there's also evidence that they're often placed in communities of color, or they're placed on roads that don't have good infrastructure, because in those communities, there has been chronic disinvestment in the infrastructure to begin with. So there's a great study out of Chicago demonstrating that Black and brown people still got more tickets, right? And then if you get a ticket, if it's a $300 ticket and you are poor, you can't pay for that. If you are a wealthy person and you get a ticket, you can pay for it, right? So, all of these, we have sort of a proceed with caution recommendation in the report around civilian enforcement and automated enforcement. There is a likely role in some level of harm reduction in certain instances, like using a speed camera on a highway, but we cannot act like those forms of enforcement are a panacea or are in some way fully divorced from the kind of bias and harm that we discussed earlier in the report and that was discussed earlier tonight. And then, we do get to a point where we believe that there are several laws that should just be removed. And I think we go through a framework and we provide a couple of examples. And one I know will make many people in this space happy and probably give others pause. But we talk about jaywalking and the concept of jaywalking. And if you walk through our framework, you will find that there is very little evidence that people are safer walking in crosswalks. You're almost as likely to get hit in a crosswalk as you are when you are crossing mid-block. Favorite pastime of people in the Boston area, as you all know. And so there isn't actually a safety reason why this law is on the books. Almost all of the evidence that shows that when jaywalking is enforced, which is considered a traffic violation, just like pulling someone over from a car, there is racial bias. There are several studies from several places that show it's basically just an excuse to stop people on the street who are suspect in some way. And then you go up the ladder of harm. So from a safety perspective, if we are focusing on the needs of those who are vulnerable, we would recommend that jaywalking be removed entirely as a violation from law, and that any effort short of that leaves potential for harm, right? You can deprioritize it, but it's still on the books. you can do all kinds of things to dance around it, but it's still there and it just doesn't need to be. We also name the debt-based license suspension as something that we believe from a safety perspective should be entirely eliminated. You should not be able to be pulled over. You should not, there's no, from a traffic safety perspective, there's no reason why debt-based license suspension is helping anyone. And you can go through a safety analysis and see that someone who simply couldn't pay a fee because they couldn't pay their registration, because they missed a mailer, that is not a cause of harm to a vulnerable road user. And so, we recommend a process in the long term for the legislature, for local officials to go through the laws, to really start looking at them with a serious eye and doing the hard work of peeling back some of those laws that simply cause harm and do not produce a safe and equitable result. And just running through a very high level set of recommendations, we both offer recommendations for agencies and city departments that can be enacted without state law changes. So some of those things include, starting by deprioritizing pretextual stops, creating Vision Zero plans that do not include police enforcement as part of that plan, collecting and reporting out on crash data, using civilians for things like block parties, which we, like demonstrating block parties, helping with parades, helping with construction. There are lots of things that civilians could do that we currently employ police officers to do. And on the legislative side, we also have a set of recommendations that would require legislative action, like banning pretextual stops, banning debt-based license suspension. There's a great bill that is making progress right now around giving folks who are undocumented the ability to get a driver's license, which we strongly support because it is much safer for people to go through the process of learning, of getting a driver's license, right? And demonstrating that they know how to drive a car. So these are all things that we think are really important and that we would like to see move forward in the legislature. And happy to chat more, but I'm going to turn it back to you, Dr. Natapoff.
Thank you so much. There's so much here, so many places to choose to begin. I think for our collective memory, it's worth remembering that jaywalking was the offense that police in Ferguson used to stop Michael Brown before they killed him. That jaywalking is not that it has taken on historic significance. Philando Castile, who was killed by police, was stopped for a traffic violation. So in addition to the debt, in addition to incarceration, in addition to the marks and burdens of the criminal record and the criminal experience, we have also permitted these low-level offenses, these misdemeanors, to be a doorway through which people of color and poor people and vulnerable people are overexposed to police violence. And to the extent that we're ever tempted to think that misdemeanors or traffic are minor, we should always keep in mind that they have been a doorway into some of the most difficult conversations we have about our forms of governance. I want to pick up on Ms. Thompson's point and connect it back to something that Dr. Owusu said. And Dr. Owusu, I want to give you a chance here to elaborate on a point you began to make about your findings about race and discretion in this particular jurisdiction. And I just want to frame it in the following way. And the reason it's, I think, especially rich is that it's a problem that we grapple with in the criminal system all the time. That sometimes reform in the criminal system is a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole. So you get rid of one law or one problem and the same phenomenon pops up someplace else. And very specifically, the country has been, embarked on this journey of the decriminalization of marijuana over the past number of years. And one of the motivations, not the only motivation, but one of the motivations was this a recognition that marijuana possession laws, which the largest category of drug enforcement in this country, still even after decriminalization and legalization, that it is enforced in a racially disparate and discriminate way, that Black people are swept into the criminal system as a result of marijuana enforcement in wildly disproportionate numbers. And since we all apparently use marijuana at approximately the same rate, it's one of those offenses that we can look and see the disparity in enforcement compared to the disparity of offense rate, which we sometimes it's not always as clear to see. And one of the things that we have seen is that in communities and jurisdictions where there has been decriminalization, in other words, we've scrolled back enforcement, we still see racial disparities. Sometimes we even see greater racial disparities in the enforcement of the decriminalized offenses. So this problem of the exercise of discretion in these low-level, often informal spaces and interactions between individuals and police is an enormous problem in the criminal system. So, Dr. Owusu, can you share a little more with us about what you found here in Suffolk County and some of your conclusions?
Yes, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. And you raised several really important points. I think, you were exactly right that I think looking at the experience of other states, I think New York is one where they've done this research. They found that marijuana prosecutions went down a lot when it was decriminalized, but the racial disparities went up. If you're going to still be getting in trouble for marijuana, it's even more likely now that you're a Black person, right? And I think we see something similar here. When I think about these kinds of policies, it really does, I think come down to how you operationalize your goal, right? There's a way in which you can have done this where you legislate that some of these things are no longer criminal, for example, or you can, use a discretionary sort of tactic. And I think one of the challenges here is that the criminal legal system is really like a long, convoluted system that includes many agencies that may have, even competing incentives. And so as a DA, you might have, one policy interest that's going to be opposed by, say, police or people who are working, further downstream in the system. And so I think there really is, I think, a push and pull between what is possible and what people can do given where they are in the system and what is going to be the most effective here. But I always look at ways that we can take things out of the framework of punishment as a first step, right? I think you end up with a conversation that really circles a drain when you're thinking about how do we punish people the most equally for things. And I think I often find that calculus is not one that really gets places. You end up in this world of like, okay, what are real drug use rates? Can we figure this out from looking at wastewater to understand the usage rates across race, and then we'll look at the incarceration rates and they should be the same. I actually don't think that's a good outcome if Black people and white people are now being incarcerated for marijuana at the same rate. I think there's no reason that should be happening. And so I often spin my wheels for a while and then take a step back and say really the thing that we're talking about isn't a solution to the problem anyway. And so that's why it seems very high stakes in a lot of ways, because we're really thinking about meeting out these punishments is our go-to tool. And so the who is protected and who is not becomes really, really high stakes. I think these things become a lot less high stakes in general if we're coming at it from a framework of how do we support people to address the underlying issues that are at play here. And so, I think there are real limits to the ways that you can address racial disparities through discretion, because bias, exists everywhere. And if it's not, it might not be explicit, but it's going to be maybe implicit, right? It's going to continue to be there. And unless you have sort of a place where you think that doesn't exist, you always have to plan around it. I think the way you plan around this is by focusing on the ways that you can support folks and get through to the root causes that are leading to these problems, right? I think people are much less worried about this if what we're doing is putting in better infrastructure than rather than thinking about who's getting stopped by the police. And so I think really, I always come back to how do we reframe this conversation so it's not about conflict between people who are about who needs to be subject to these kinds of things, and more like how do we collaboratively think through this.
Thank you so much. I want to pick up a thread that you put out there to call criminal law a tool. It's a means to an end. And Ms. Thompson, earlier you said that there are multiple meanings of safety, and that we can aim for safety. We can aim for safe streets, for safe communities, for safe families, for safe workplaces in many different ways. The United States, of course, is famous for using criminal law as a central tool. We are famous worldwide for the levels of our mass incarceration. We incarcerate more people than any other country does. We incarcerate more people than all of Western Europe combined. So it's worth noting that one of the fingerprints of our system of governance is that we keep turning to this tool, the tool of criminal law, and we need not. Ms. Thompson, you also mentioned earlier that the impulse, the go-to impulse, we have a problem, let's go to the police. We have a problem, we need more police. We use law enforcement in all these spaces. We are seeing this, of course, across the country, rethinking this impulse, this wildly expensive and often ineffectual impulse to use the criminal law to do all kinds of work that it is not well suited to do. I think one of the things that we should appreciate, that some developments over the past few years, as I mentioned earlier, we have seen now many prosecutors speaking out and changing their policies so as to be more focused about the way the criminal law is used. And we have also seen many police departments speak in the same vein. They have told us that we ask them to do too much. They're called for everything, for mental health crises, for domestic disputes, for traffic, for serious violence, and for everything in between. And they tell us, many of these police chiefs and police departments, that one of their challenges is that it's hard for them to be accountable when every crisis we turn to them and ask them, what are you doing about it? And so it is also on us, I think. And Ms. Thompson, I'm going to turn it over to you in a minute because I want to give you a chance to tell us a little more about the proposals that you're putting on the table and how they relate to this national conversation we are having about asking other branches of government, other arms of government, other entities to do the work that we currently ask police to do.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will be candid in saying yes. It's sort of this vicious cycle where a tragedy occurs. We ask for policing. The policing doesn't work. We maybe carve out a little money to put a cone on a street corner as a bump out, and then it doesn't work, and then someone dies, and we repeat this cycle, right? And I think it's hard. We primarily engage with transportation departments, and even within those spaces where those engineers and those planners know that the best way to keep folks safe is a really great elevated sidewalk and really strong protected bike lanes and really narrow roads and lots of great signage and lots of lighting and all these things that we care about. They too will sometimes become defensive and say, well, but we need the police for X, Y, and Z. And I think that there's an interesting thing that happens where we hear we're overworked. We can't put a police officer on every street corner. But then the second someone like me says, great, that actually isn't the best use of your time. We need many millions more dollars to put a bike lane in. People freak out because I'm taking a parking space away, right? So like there is this push and pull where it's like there's this inability to connect the dots. And I struggle as an advocate trying to make it clear that like, I think it's really okay for us to take a parking space away because it will literally save lives. It will save us money. It will be better for the police department. It will be better for the transportation department. It will be better for the thousands of people who travel along that corridor every day. And we can find a different place to store that vehicle. Like all of these things can happen at the same time. And so I just want to acknowledge this sort of cycle that we're in, and that it's really hard to decouple those natural, that we all do, those natural sort of reactions. The assumption that putting a bike lane down, putting in a really great crossing for pedestrians is going to cause catastrophic congestion, and that we just can't do that. And the only solution is to, put a police officer out there with a speed gun and hope for the best, right? Like we just have to give up that notion, and that's really hard. But that's why we try to be practical in the report. So I will note that we don't go into all of the design interventions for street safety in our report, but we do point to great resources like NACDO and many other places that can show you exactly how to design a street to make it safe. We do also name and call for what I would say community intervention. So one thing that I always find striking is that something bad will happen, and then there will be a call for police intervention. But then there is often not an unpacking of that, right? That one of the things that we do at Livable Streets is try to keep having the conversation. Okay, so you asked for a police officer, but what if I told you, I would give an example. There was a corridor in the Boston area a couple of years ago that saw 29 crashes in 30 days because there was drag racing. And so the initial reaction is, we need more police out here. This is dangerous. But we work with street ambassadors. That's our program where we have people from the community talk to their neighbors. And when you have a conversation that's like, did you know that if we put bike lanes down, it will narrow the road and it'll be harder to speed? It'll deter people from drag racing. We found that the community had more than 60% support for adding bike lanes and better crosswalks to that infrastructure. And so I think, one, community engagement is discussed a lot. It is a component of our report, but I would uplift it as like, we have to have deeper conversations, and we have to do more than react to what I think is a natural gut reaction, and go to the next level and say, actually, this is what the interventions do. Actually, this is how we can move forward together, and to continue that authentic cycle of communication and start there and move as far away from as we can from the criminal justice sort of non-solution solution that we have been trained as a society over the course of hundreds of years to depend on.
Dr. Owusu, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind as we consider why people continue to look to the police as the first sort of call when something goes wrong is they're resourced to be that, right? I think I've heard a lot of police chiefs say, we don't want to have these, overdoses and mental health crises and X, Y, and Z things on our plate. And then when they say, all right, great, we'll use the budget that you're getting to do that, to fund somebody else to do that and make sure that they're available 24 hours a day and that they have coverage across the entire city. And they say like, no, we actually won't give up any money. And so I think that's part of it, is like nobody's actually resourced to do these other kinds of things. And so I think in a very real sense, you could say that a lot of cities have straight up never tried an alternative in the sense of resourcing it to even the same order of magnitude as a police response. And so I think it is fair to ask a lot of a police department if it's got, such a huge budget to be able to solve these problems. And I think to the extent that those responsibilities are unwanted or going to be passed off to somebody else, the budget that's associated with those responsibilities needs to be passed on to somebody else so they can have that same kind of response. I would be shocked if you gave the budget, the same size to like the Department of Transportation and DMV to figure out street safety if they were not pulling, at least much better numbers than we are pulling on traffic safety right now. We're just not investing at the same scale. And so you have to ask the people who are being paid to do the thing to deliver. And if they don't, the money's got to move too.
Yeah, these are great points. We have now a bunch of questions from the audience that I want to make sure we get to touch on at least some of them. And a number of them touch on a broad question, and I want to give both our panelists a chance to think about it, and they have to do with data collection. And I think in particular, an advocacy organization that of course depends on the ability to collect and share data in order to make policy recommendations, then of course, Dr. Owusu, your ability to do this work depended on public data. But of course, there is a dark side to data, and in particular, a dark side to automated data. So we worry about these matters a lot in criminal law, our individual privacy. So you could imagine an argument that cameras on every corner would increase traffic safety, but they also would destroy our privacy on public streets, and it would entirely change, the nature of our public spaces. So, and of course, we can't do this work without data. And the possibilities for data collection are exploding with new technologies. The government has the ability to both to create and collect data on us in ways that it just didn't have, years ago. And of course, this is connected to the points that both of you were making about the risks of discretion and the misuse of that data against vulnerable people and vulnerable groups. So I want to give you each a chance. Ms. Thompson, let's start with you to think about the role of data collection. How much is it, you used the word panacea before, how much is it a solution? How much is having automated traffic monitoring a solution? How much of it is a problem? Share some of your insights with us.
Yes, I feel like we should just schedule the part 2 now for this discussion to get into data. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it all, is it going to take over? But I want to touch on 2 points. So one, surveillance, talking about the data that is collected from cameras. So this is where I point to great partners like the ACLU and many others who are leading on trying to improve surveillance laws in Massachusetts. So we are in this strange conundrum right now where camera enforcement is not allowed, but there are cameras everywhere in this state, right? And they can be used in lots of ways to collect lots of data, and people have access to it, and it's like a real problem. And so collecting information via cameras and that information can still go to police departments and be used in a really problematic way, right? Data, there are so many ways that information can be collected without consent, without notification, be given to people who don't want to use it in a good way. And so starting with protections is long overdue in the state of Massachusetts. So I would name that. Separately, we can't do our jobs without collecting some data. And so, from our perspective, there's bias in data everywhere, and there's bias in how people, the questions people choose to ask in the first place. So for example, the data that we cite about the effectiveness of policing and crashes is fairly limited because despite the billions and billions of federal, state, and local funds that we put into policing for traffic enforcement, almost no one studies if it's effective. Right? They don't ask that question. So the data we have is helpful, but there isn't nearly as much data on all the other things we're trying to prove that are helpful. We also have a lot of trouble getting the kind of crash data that we need about where crashes happened and why that could help us make better design solutions. So we're essentially collecting data in a way that incentivizes punitive measures that send people into the carceral state and are deeply absent from collecting data that would help us make choices and produce interventions that are based on design, education, and good policy. I'm going to turn over to you, Dr. Owusu, because I'm sure you have additional thoughts on this.
Please.
Thank you. I think those are all really good points. I'll just say a couple of things quickly. I think I work at the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. as a data scientist. And the thing that I came there to do is there was a law that was passed that was basically, it did many things, but it was trying to get the police to report data on their traffic and pedestrian stops. And that was a law that was passed. And this was one that people in the community had advocated for, right? People wanted this data to be shared and to be, as an input to, hold the police accountable in many ways. There was actually a lawsuit, I think, by the ACLU that, said they were not in compliance, and eventually they had to hire somebody who could actually put this data out. And I was one of the people who helped work on that. And so that's something that's available right now. And I just say that to say that on the one hand, there's like data as a concern about privacy, but over and over I hear that people in communities want to understand what's happening and what's being done in their communities at a systematic level so they can use that to understand and advocate for that, right? And so I think that's one thing that I don't think is named quite enough when we think about data and the use of it in the criminal legal system space. I think privacy comes first. I think that's really important, for good reason that it comes first. But I just wanted to say that I think a lot of people see it as super empowering to be able to understand these things at a systematic level, and it has been able to inform sort of more engaged and active communities. And it's a demand that came from the community. It's not like I showed up and said, this is what I wanted to do. It was like something that was already there. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I often see this as like police departments and whoever are going to be using data and collecting data and have been in various forms in a very sort of systematic and detailed way for their goals and for their ends, right? They collect the data that's going to help them tell the stories they want to tell. And I think that, that's not going to stop. I think in many ways, there are people who full time like look at Instagram posts from teenagers at police departments just to see if they're going to have a beef with somebody so they can like develop files on them, even people without records. Like that's happening. They're already pushing for drones to be, doing all these kinds of things. The ATE systems are deployed, right? Even if you don't think about the public uses, I know one of the big incentives that the police department here was trying to push was homeowners getting cameras installed. They would help subsidize and install, and they wanted those things so that when something happened, they could tap into these home security systems, right? All those, Ring or like Nest or whatever cameras, right? That ship has sailed. The question is, do we also want data that's going to be responsive to help us actually make better policies, to hold people accountable, and to sort of produce the kinds of outcomes that we want collectively as a community? Do we also want that, or just the bad data that's being used to surveil? Do we want to say use our automated traffic enforcement infrastructure to do something other than write tickets? You totally can. And that's something that we're doing in DC, right? A project that I'm helping to work on to try and pilot this idea. To say, hey, if we could think about all this data as a thing that could be used to maybe educate folks about, and understand where risks are, and then send targeted interventions that don't give people tickets or points on their record, but information about their risk relative to others. And maybe that's something that can help people drive a little bit more safely. There's other things you could do besides just like writing somebody a ticket with that information, right? And so I really think of this as this information and data revolution is happening, and I don't think there's a world in which this like cat goes back in the bag. It's just, are we going to only have it be used for certain kinds of things where it's already happening, or are we going to sort of make a play as well? And that's where I really see myself as coming in to take these things and say, what good can come from this? It's not just bad. So what good can come from this? Because the bad is going to be there kind of regardless of what we do. So.
There's a famous saying in criminal law: sunlight is the best disinfectant. And it's a little trite because sometimes you can think of examples where that isn't true at all. I don't want sunlight in my life. I don't want the state to be shining sunlight in all of my spaces. But what it refers to is not. It's not a personal call. It's about governance. It's about living and working and being in a democracy in which we expect accountability from our elected officials and our appointed officials, and of course police are appointed officials. And so in that sense, I take Dr. Owusu's point that the data revolution is happening whether we like it or not. That data and information is being collected all across the spectrum. But of course, the conversation about criminal justice has been irrevocably changed by the availability of information, the availability, of course, of individual videos. We would not know about George Floyd if it wasn't for the ability of individuals to collect data and to share it publicly. The push for body cameras, the push for data on racial profiling, on the nature of stops and frisks and auto stops. And even before the data revolution in the criminal system, it has always been understood that data is one response to discretion. In other words, if we're giving police and prosecutors this enormous discretion to make decisions about our lives, about our liberty, about our privacy, then we need information in order to be able to hold them accountable. And it's one of the jobs, indeed, of our criminal system. We often think of the criminal system as only going after individuals, but the institutional role of the criminal system is also to keep criminal justice officials and players accountable. And one of the ways we do that is by collecting information and to think creatively about the kinds of information that we might be able to collect now that we have so many more technologies at our disposal. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to, there are quite a few other questions in the chat, but I think that we're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure that both of you get a chance to share any last thoughts or conversations with each other that our audience hasn't been able to have. So, Dr. Owusu, let me turn this over to you and ask you, are there any last ways that you would like us to be able to pull these thoughts together and how to think about these problems? And then Ms. Thompson, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say a couple of quick points. I usually, every time I give a talk about my research, kind of regardless of the topic, I usually start with a slide that just highlights other folks' research in this area, and specifically thinking about just the criminal legal system as a very, very costly way to produce public safety. And I have just like, it's a page of citations that people's eyes glaze over, but it talks about the studies, the well-done studies that have found negative impacts of people being involved with the criminal legal system on like political engagement, educational outcomes, psychological distress, public health, economic marginalization, and in some cases, like it's criminogenic in that being treated with the being involved with the criminal legal system makes you more likely to engage in more crime later. And that's particularly true when it engages with our young people and kids. So I think that's just really important context for this. I think that's something that's come up a lot. But we've talked about, I think, a lot of these concrete harms, incarceration, fines, fees, but this is much deeper than that. It really speaks to a broader impact on our communities. And these costs are borne really, really unequally. That's another really important point here. And so I think a lot of the times when people are having conversations or speaking past each other, it really just speaks to that people experience these systems fundamentally differently. The criminal justice system is a different thing for you than it might be for somebody else. And so I just wanted to highlight that as some context. And then with regard to pretextual stops, this is not something that I've been able to do a ton of research on yet, but I wanted to lift up some work by other folks. I know Conrad Miller is a researcher, I think, at UC Berkeley, who's done some research on this. Pretextual stops tend to be low yield and are notoriously known for racial disparities and the possibility of escalating into unsafe situations, as Professor Natapoff mentioned in some of these examples, right? So I think I just wanted to highlight that we haven't talked about this quite as much, but if folks are thinking, well, it's not just about the traffic safety, it's about we're getting guns from these stops, or we're getting, all these other things that are going on. It is just, the research does not bear out that that's a very effective way of getting, say, guns off our street. Random traffic stops just don't seem to be very effective, and they're hugely implicated in terms of racial disparities and who seems like they might be at risk or a risky person in that case. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is a little bit about, I think, discretion. I think one thing that I learned, or I've been inferred from this, is I think it almost humanized the decision makers in this research. When I was thinking about line ADAs and the sort of cases that come across their desk, the guidance that they're facing from their boss, and what decisions they make in real time. I think a lot of the time this research focuses on defendants and people who are being having their cases handled, but this was really focused on the decision makers and how do they take guidance from their boss, basically. And I think one thing that stood out to me is just how concentrated the effects were on traffic stuff. And I thought, what about traffic would make it, I think, an area where people feel comfortable, deviating. I think, of course, some of it is the issues that we've talked about in terms of it's, I think, an area where it's quite obvious that there's not really a great reason for the criminal courts to be handling something that seems like it could be handled better in another way. But I also think it speaks to the how the extent to which people can understand alternatives. I think there are cases where if you have somebody who's dealing with drugs or trespassing because they're unhoused, and the guidance is, well, help that person get housing. If there's not actually a well-mapped set of resources for that in our community, and you're a person who's got a job that's not to be a caseworker, and you have a bunch of cases on your docket. I think that's something that's just like really important that we think about. What we have in our community is available alternatives. I think empowers people to use their discretion to do the right thing. I think people would feel much more confident if there was a place they could send people who are dealing with substance abuse issues or mental health issues or economic issues. If there's like, I know the job training program for you, it's well resourced by the state of Massachusetts, right this way. We have that for some things, right? We have that for drunk driving. We don't have that for other kinds of things. And I think that's something that really stuck out to me, is like, as a person who needs to wade through these kinds of systems, how we equip the people who need to make these decisions probably matters a lot. And that is something that I took away from seeing the really like the heterogeneous way that people responded for some kinds of cases, but not for others. So I'll end there for now.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize something you said. There was a question from the audience about what we sometimes call the productivity or the hit rates in traffic stops, and it's related to the conversation we've been having all hour about the efficacy of law enforcement to achieve the kinds of safety that we want. And the fact that we can point to a couple of instances where a gun is found or drugs are found in traffic stops does not mean that traffic stops are a good way of keeping guns off the street. And I think one of the benefits of this conversation and digging deep into the data and into what we learn and having a more holistic view of all of the things that our criminal system does, but particularly our low-level misdemeanor system, is that the costs are so extraordinarily high, and that it behooves us to be more rigorous about choosing tools, to come back to a theme that has been running through this conversation, to choose tools that provide more benefit than cost, and provide more benefit in a more egalitarian way to more people than the widespread social costs that we've been talking about for the entire hour. And just to put in a plug for Information in Sunlight, the conventional conversation, I think, around law enforcement is familiar with and fluent in the benefits. That, many a politician has run on, tough on crime and crime fighting benefits, and we have not had a similarly rigorous, in-depth conversation about the true cost, the cost to individuals in the criminal system, to their families and communities, the cost to racial justice, the cost that we incur when we criminalize poverty, and what that does to our communities and to our economy. And I think that these conversations and the police officials and the prosecutors who are willing to fully engage those conversations, I think, are doing a serious public service, not just to talk about those questions in their jurisdictions, but to expand our understanding of what we're really doing through this arm of governance. Ms. Thompson.
Thank you. I am, of course, going to attempt to do too much because there are a couple of specific questions I'm just itching to answer quickly, and then also want to wrap things up. So I do just want to respond to the question about the license for immigrants bill. That bill in Massachusetts is being led by folks who work directly with migrant populations and immigrants, and so I would turn to them. But what I can also say is that there's a wide range of immigration experiences, whether it's undocumented, underdocumented, complicatedly documented, and that can impact your ability to get a driver's license. And from our perspective, that has nothing to do with safety. So I encourage you to look at the report and look at the bill for more information and the great organizations that are already leading that work. There's another great question about from a public defender saying, hey, like getting your car licensed and having insurance is important. I agree these are bad, but how do we get people to do these things? And so one thing that I would note is we should start asking people why they haven't registered their car. Instead of just making assumptions and making this a criminal offense, because usually it's I didn't know, I couldn't pay for it, I didn't have a regular place to live, right? And start addressing those problems. And I also want to note on the insurance front that car insurance tends to be more expensive in communities of color and underinvested communities because the roads suck there. So you were also asking people who in low-income communities and communities of color to pay more and then are criminalizing their inability to pay for that thing. And so I think that there are solutions that could help people get insurance and subsidize that insurance, and to, deal with this issue of registration that have nothing to do, again, with the courts. And we are happy to help you think through that. But I think what I'm hoping this builds to, and my larger point, or I hope my takeaway, is that despite our gut reactions and our natural inclinations to go to what we've always assumed would be the right path, there are many ways that we can achieve safety for people who are who are feeling unsafe in many different settings that go well beyond people feeling safe walking, biking, and driving, that don't involve the police, right? That I hope that there are solutions, there are paths forward, that we can't stop at this, like, this is hard, right? Or right, that it's so easy to say, I know the data, but I had this, my personal experience is that I was treated this way, and therefore we need to have the police intervene. There are so many solutions. Our report is 50 pages long, and it is like a corner of the solutions that many, many, many other organizations have put out in the world for like many decades ahead of us. And so I just want to end with like a note of immense gratitude. I started by saying I am not a criminal justice expert. This is our first attempt to try to do better and to actually be thinking about traffic safety from a more holistic approach. And so I cannot express enough gratitude to my co-panelists tonight, and to just the multitude of authors and researchers and advocates and leaders who we resourced, who we learned from, who we referenced, all of the ones that we didn't, who led before them. Like, I just cannot express to you the breadth of information and options and paths forward that we can take, that we must take, and that are available. And I also have to shout out my co-authors, Catherine Gleason and Louisa Gegg, and the designer of our report, Lorraine Fryer, on my staff. I'm the one talking. They were the ones who did much more research and writing. And I just say that at the end of the day, I am still an advocate, and we are still here to help. This is, for us, a report is always the beginning of the conversation, and we hope to have many more conversations to move some of these actions into reality. So thank you so much.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank the Rappaport Institute and GBH for having us. Thanks to everybody who listened in and who asked questions. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thanks to everybody.